The sound came first, an abrupt, violent rupture that tore through the stillness of the forest like a gunshot, followed by the metallic scream of twisting steel and the hollow thud of something heavy leaving the road. For a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then came the echo, bouncing uselessly between the trees, before everything fell into an almost unnatural silence. No passing cars, no voices, only the low hiss of a cooling engine and the faint rustle of leaves disturbed by a night wind that hadn't yet decided which direction to blow. Jonah McCreary's vehicle had left the road at a sharp curve most locals barely noticed anymore, a bend they took on muscle memory alone. The headlights, now shattered, had briefly illuminated the trunks of ancient pines as the car plunged down the embankment, clipping branches on the way, before slamming nose first into the rocky ground below. The impact folded metal inward with merciless efficiency, the kind that should have ended everything in a single, final instant. And yet, somewhere in the aftermath of that chaos, Jonah was still alive. Steam rose slowly from the crumpled hood, drifting upward like a ghost unsure of where to go next. A single door hung open at an awkward angle, creaking softly each time the wind nudged it. Inside the wreck, the smell of gasoline mixed with damp earth, sharp and suffocating. The radio, miraculously still working, emitted a low hiss of static, as if trying, and failing, to reach someone who could listen. Beyond the wreckage, the woods stretched on endlessly, dark and indifferent, swallowing sound and light alike. When the first responders arrived, guided by a delayed emergency call and the faint reflection of twisted metal off the ravine, they expected the worst. Scenes like this usually offered grim certainties. But as flashlights swept across the wreckage and boots crunched through gravel and broken glass, confusion set in. There was blood inside the car, smeared across the steering wheel and the torn fabric of the driver's seat. The windshield was spiderwebbed, caved inward from the force of a human body colliding with it. Everything about the scene spoke of violence, pain, and survival, at least for a little while. What it did not show was Jonah McCreary. There was no body pinned inside the vehicle, no figure unconscious on the forest floor. Instead, there were signs that told a stranger story. A set of unsteady footprints led away from the wreck, impressions pressed deep into the soft earth, as if the person who made them had been injured, disoriented, or both. They moved toward the trees, then abruptly stopped, vanishing as completely as if the ground itself had decided to erase them. Searchlights cut through the darkness, tracing the edge of the ravine, scanning the branches overhead, but Jonah was nowhere to be found. The woods answered only with silence. Minutes turned into hours as more help arrived, and the scene grew crowded with questions no one could yet answer. How far could an injured man have gone in the dark? Why would he leave the relative safety of the road instead of waiting by the wreck? And most unsettling of all, how could someone survive a crash like that, only to disappear without a trace? How does a man survive a catastrophe only to vanish into thin air? To understand why Jonah McCreary's disappearance unsettled so many people, it is necessary to step away from the wreckage in the ravine and pause the relentless forward motion of events, if only for a moment. Before he became a name attached to flashing lights and unanswered questions, Jonah was a man with routines, habits, and small, quiet details that anchored him to the world in ways no official report could ever fully capture. Jonah was, above all else, a meticulous planner. Friends often joke that he lived his life as if every day were a carefully drafted blueprint, complete with margins, annotations, and backup plans. He was not impulsive, nor was he drawn to unnecessary risks. He liked knowing where he was going, how long it would take to get there, and what awaited him at the end of the road. That sense of order gave him comfort, and in many ways, it defined how others saw him. Reliable, thoughtful, and steady in a world that often felt anything but. He lived a relatively quiet life, one that did not attract much attention from outsiders. Jonah wasn't the type to dominate a room or demand to be heard. Instead, he listened more than he spoke, offering carefully chosen words when he did. Those close to him described him as someone who found meaning in consistency. Morning coffee prepared the same way every day, evening walks taken at the same hour, weekends reserved for familiar places that felt safe and predictable. It was in those patterns that Jonah felt most like himself. There was also a deeply reflective side to him, one that rarely surfaced in conversation but revealed itself in solitude. Jonah kept notebooks, plain, unremarkable ones, that he filled with observations, sketches, and occasional fragments of thought. He wasn't a writer in any professional sense, but he had a habit of documenting the world around him, as if afraid that important details might slip away if he didn't pin them down on paper. A crooked fence post on a back road, the way fog settled over a lake at dawn, the exact mileage between two towns he had driven through dozens of times. To Jonah, these details mattered. The day he disappeared was not supposed to be remarkable. He wasn't chasing adventure or testing his limits. He was traveling for a reason that fit neatly into the life he had built. A routine trip, one he had taken before, to a place that felt familiar enough to require no second thoughts. There was no celebration planned, no secret meeting, no dramatic farewell that hinted at what was coming. If anything, that normalcy made what followed even more disturbing. Those who knew him would later fixate on that fact. Jonah had no reason to vanish. He had plans extending weeks, even months into the future, appointments scheduled, responsibilities he took seriously, small promises he never would have broken intentionally. Disappearing without a word ran counter to everything he was. It wasn't just out of character. It felt almost impossible. One small detail, mentioned almost in passing by a family member, lingered in the minds of investigators and armchair theorists alike. Jonah had a habit of double-checking things, locks, routes, weather forecasts, sometimes to the point of excess. He would often turn back after leaving the house just to make sure the door was truly locked, even if he knew it was. It was a harmless quirk, almost endearing, and yet, in hindsight, it raised a haunting question. How does someone so careful, so deliberate, end up at the center of an accident that spiraled so completely out of control? Looking back, there was nothing overtly ominous about Jonah McCreary's life. No dark secrets waiting to surface, no obvious signs of distress that might explain a sudden desire to disappear. Just a man moving through his days with quiet intention, unaware that one ordinary journey would sever him from everything he knew. And that is what makes the story ache with a particular kind of sadness. Jonah was not a mystery by nature. He was known, predictable, and deeply rooted in his own small world, which only deepens the unease left behind by his absence. Because when someone like Jonah vanishes, it feels less like a choice and more like a rupture in reality itself. The final day of Jonah McCreary's known life began without drama, the kind of unremarkable morning that rarely earns a second thought until it becomes the subject of painful hindsight. The sky was a muted gray, not threatening enough to suggest danger, yet heavy enough to dull the colors of the world. It was the sort of weather that pressed softly against the senses, quiet and still, as if the day itself were waiting. Jonah woke early, as he always did. His routines remained intact, almost stubbornly so, right up until the moment they ended. He prepared his coffee with the same measured precision, standing at the counter while the kettle warmed, staring absently out the window as thin clouds drifted overhead. Nothing in his movements suggested anxiety or hesitation. If there was any sense of unease inside him, it never reached the surface. By late morning, Jonah was on the road. The route he took that day was not unusual. It was a familiar stretch of highway bordered by long segments of forest and sparsely spaced towns that seemed to exist in quiet isolation from one another. The drive was one he had made before, enough times to know where the road curved sharply and where cell service tended to fade. It was precisely the kind of journey his methodical nature favored, predictable, straightforward, and free of surprises. The atmosphere outside shifted subtly as the hours passed. The air grew cooler, and the sky darkened just enough to cast elongated shadows across the pavement. There was no storm yet, but there was a sense of something building, an oppressive calm that settled over the landscape. The trees along the roadside stood motionless, their branches forming a dense, unbroken wall that swallowed sound. Even the traffic thinned, leaving Jonah alone with the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic lines of asphalt unspooling beneath him. The last confirmed contact with Jonah came in the early evening. He had pulled over briefly at a small service area, one of those places that existed more out of necessity than comfort. He made a short call, mundane, unremarkable in content, to someone close to him. His voice was calm, unhurried. He mentioned the drive, the fading light, perhaps even the weather, in the casual way people do when they expect to continue the conversation later. There was no sense of urgency, no hint that anything was wrong. Those final words would later be replayed in memory with merciless clarity. Nothing about them suggested a man on the brink of disaster. If anything, they reinforced the illusion that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. As Jonah continued his drive, night began to close in. The road narrowed, and the forest pressed closer, reducing the world to a tunnel of darkness broken only by the sweep of his headlights. The temperature dropped, and a thin layer of moisture clung to the air, dampening sound and visibility. It was during this stretch, quiet, isolated, and deceptively familiar, that the margin for error grew dangerously thin. No one can say what Jonah was thinking in those final moments before the accident. Perhaps his mind was on the destination ahead, or on some small detail waiting to be written down later in one of his notebooks. Perhaps he was simply lost in the meditative rhythm of driving, trusting a road he believed he knew. What is certain is that, somewhere along that darkened curve, normality fractured. The carefully ordered day unraveled in an instant, giving way to twisted metal, broken glass, and a silence that would stretch far beyond that night. And in the hours that followed, as the forest reclaimed its stillness, the last ordinary moments of Jonah McCreary's life slipped quietly into history, unnoticed at the time, yet destined to be examined endlessly, frame by frame, in the search for answers that never seemed to come. When investigators later attempted to reconstruct what happened on that stretch of road, they began with the curve itself, a deceptively ordinary bend that gave no warning of how unforgiving it could be. By daylight, it looked almost harmless, a gentle arc carved through dense forest, marked by a modest guardrail that bore the scars of previous encounters. At night, however, the curve transformed. The absence of streetlights, the way the trees swallowed peripheral vision, and the subtle slope of the asphalt combined to create a trap that revealed itself only when it was already too late. Jonah's car approached that curve at a speed that was not reckless, but perhaps just fast enough to leave no room for correction. Tire marks later found on the pavement suggested a sudden realization, a brief moment when instinct took over and the steering wheel was wrenched hard to the left. The tires screamed in protest, a sharp, piercing sound that must have echoed through the trees before losing their grip entirely. From there, physics took control. The vehicle clipped the edge of the guardrail, tearing through weakened metal as if it were paper. The impact redirected the car just enough to send it airborne for a terrifying fraction of a second. In that suspended moment, the headlights cut wildly through the darkness, illuminating bark, branches, and open space where the ground should have been. Then gravity reclaimed its claim. The car crashed down the embankment nose first, striking rocks and earth with a force that crushed the front end inward. The engine block shifted violently, the hood buckled, and the windshield exploded into a web of fractured glass. Inside, Jonah's body was thrown forward, restrained only partially by the seatbelt, which left deep bruising across his chest and shoulder. Blood spattered the dashboard and steering column, evidence of a head wound that, while severe, was not immediately fatal. This was the detail that would later haunt everyone involved. Emergency responders, guided by the damage pattern and the condition of the interior, concluded that Jonah had survived the initial impact. The driver's side door showed signs of being forced open from the inside, bent outward at an unnatural angle. The seatbelt had been unlatched, not torn. These were not the signs of a man who died instantly. They were the actions of someone who was conscious, injured, confused, but alive. Outside the vehicle, the evidence grew stranger. Footprints led away from the wreckage, uneven and staggered, pressing deep into the damp soil. They told a silent story of pain and disorientation, of a man struggling to stay upright as he moved toward the forest. Drops of blood appeared sporadically along the path, dark stains that clung to leaves and stones, marking his progress like breadcrumbs scattered into the night. Then, without warning, the trail ended. There were no signs of a fall, no indication that he had collapsed where the footprints stopped. No drag marks, no additional blood pooling in the soil. It was as if Jonah had simply stepped out of the narrative altogether. Search teams would later comb the area with meticulous care, expanding their radius again and again, convinced they had simply missed something. But the forest yielded nothing. No body, no clothing, no further tracks. The ground beyond that point was soft enough to capture impressions, yet it remained undisturbed, mocking the logic of the situation. The question that lingered, heavy and inescapable, was not whether Jonah survived the crash. The evidence strongly suggested that he did. The real mystery lay in what happened next. An injured man, alone in the dark, with no clear direction and no immediate shelter, should have left a trail, something tangible, something final. Instead, Jonah McCreary walked away from a catastrophic accident and vanished into the woods, leaving behind only broken metal, fading footprints, and a silence that refused to explain itself. By the time the full scope of Jonah McCreary's disappearance became clear, the forest around the crash site was no longer quiet. It pulsed with urgency, voices calling his name, radios crackling with clipped instructions, and the steady churn of boots cutting fresh paths through undergrowth that had not been disturbed in years. What had begun as a routine emergency response quickly escalated into a full-scale search, driven by the shared belief that Jonah was still out there, injured and in desperate need of help. Search and rescue teams arrived in waves, joined by local law enforcement, volunteers, and later, trained trackers who knew how to read the subtle language of the land. They moved methodically, establishing grids and expanding outward from the point where Jonah's footprints had ended. Every fallen branch, every depression in the soil, was examined for meaning. Dogs were brought in, their noses pressed low to the ground as handlers followed anxiously behind, hoping for a clear direction, any direction. At first, there was optimism. The evidence suggested Jonah had been alive after the crash, and in cases like that, people were often found within hours, sometimes miles away, but still reachable. But as daylight faded into another night, that optimism began to erode. The dogs struggled to maintain a consistent scent, losing it abruptly in the same area where the footprints disappeared. Thermal imaging scans revealed nothing but cold earth and dense foliage. The forest seemed to absorb every effort, returning nothing in exchange. Then came the first anomaly. A personal item, one that Jonah was known to carry with him consistently, was found far beyond the initial search perimeter. It lay near a shallow stream, several miles from the crash site, in a direction that made little sense given the terrain. There were no clear paths leading to it, no corresponding footprints nearby, and no signs that someone had deliberately placed it there. It simply existed, out of context, as if dropped by accident or moved by forces no one could account for. This discovery fractured the working theories almost instantly. Some investigators believed Jonah, disoriented by head trauma, had wandered aimlessly, covering far more ground than anyone expected before succumbing to his injuries. In that scenario, the forest itself was the culprit, cold, unforgiving, and capable of hiding a body indefinitely. Others were less convinced. The lack of consistent tracks, the sudden loss of scent, and the placement of the item near water raised uncomfortable questions. If Jonah had been moving on foot, injured and bleeding, why were there not more signs of his passage? A witness statement only deepened the unease. Days after the crash, a local resident came forward claiming they had seen a man matching Jonah's description walking along a remote access road late that same night. The timeline didn't align neatly, and the description was frustratingly vague, but the report refused to be dismissed outright. If true, it suggested Jonah had not only survived the crash, but had reached an area thought to be well outside his possible range. As theories multiplied, certainty evaporated. Accidental death, exposure, disorientation, foul play. Each explanation fits some pieces of the puzzle while leaving others conspicuously untouched. The search continued for weeks, then months, scaling back only when resources ran thin and leads dried up. In the end, what remained were questions layered atop one another, each anomaly widening the gap between what should have happened and what apparently did. Jonah McCreary had not simply been lost to an accident. Something about his disappearance resisted simple answers, leaving behind a case defined not by what was found, but by what was inexplicably missing. As the search for Jonah McCreary slowed and eventually faded from active operation to quiet case files and archived maps, a heavy stillness settled over everyone his disappearance had touched. The forest returned to its natural rhythms, the road reclaimed its anonymity, and the wreckage was cleared away, leaving behind no obvious marker of the chaos that had unfolded there. To the outside world, it became just another tragic incident, an accident followed by an unfortunate outcome. But for those who knew Jonah, and for those who studied the case closely, it was never that simple. What happened that night was not merely a crash. It was the abrupt erasure of a person from the fabric of everyday life. Jonah did not die in a hospital surrounded by explanations, nor was he found at the end of a clear trail. He survived something that should have killed him, only to disappear into uncertainty. That distinction matters, because it transforms the story from one of misfortune into one of unresolved loss. In the weeks that followed, Jonah's absence became painfully tangible in the smallest details. An unused coffee mug left in the cupboard, notebooks that ended mid-sentence, plans written down and never crossed out. There was an empty chair at the dinner table, a silence during phone calls that once came routinely, and a growing realization that there would be no final conversation to bring closure. The careful, methodical man who planned everything had left behind no explanation at all. Investigators eventually exhausted every conventional path. Theories remained theories, suspended without proof. Perhaps Jonah, gravely injured and confused, walked farther than anyone could imagine before the elements claimed him. Perhaps he reached help and something went wrong afterward, unseen and unrecorded. Or perhaps there is another explanation, one that does not fit neatly into reports or statistics, but lingers uncomfortably in the gaps between facts. What makes the case so haunting is not just that Jonah disappeared, but that he disappeared in defiance of logic. The evidence suggests survival, movement, intention, yet it leads nowhere. His story sits at the intersection of chance and choice, of accident and mystery, and it refuses to resolve itself into something easy to accept. Jonah McCreary was not just a name tied to a horrifying disappearance. He was a man with habits, plans, and a future that extended beyond that curve in the road. And somewhere between the crash and the silence that followed, that future slipped out of reach. So now, the question remains, one that continues to divide those who encounter this story. Do you think Jonah walked away from the accident intentionally, driven by confusion or some private resolve, or did the elements take him before anyone could reach him? Let me know your theory in the comments. When the official search ended, the investigation did not stop. It simply changed shape. The urgency of boots on the ground and helicopters overhead was replaced by paperwork, interviews, and long hours spent staring at photographs of the crash site pinned to bulletin boards. Jonah McCreary's case moved from the wilderness into offices and meeting rooms, where the mystery became quieter but no less disturbing. Investigators began by retracing everything that could be verified. Phone records were analyzed down to the minute, confirming Jonah's last call and mapping the gradual loss of signal as he drove deeper into the rural stretch of road. There were no suspicious messages, no sudden flurry of activity, no indication that he was meeting anyone or deviating from his expected route. His bank accounts showed nothing unusual, no withdrawals, no purchases that suggested preparation for disappearance. Financially, his life remained exactly where he had left it. Attention returned, again and again, to the crash itself. Experts were brought in to review the accident reconstruction, questioning whether something mechanical could have contributed. The brakes were tested, the steering column examined, tire condition documented. Nothing definitive emerged. The vehicle showed signs of wear consistent with its age, but no catastrophic failure that would explain a complete loss of control. In the end, the crash was ruled just that, an accident, caused by a combination of road conditions, visibility, and unforgiving terrain. Yet that conclusion offered no comfort. Interviews with family, friends, and co-workers painted a consistent picture of Jonah as stable and grounded. No one recalled arguments, threats, or conflicts that might suggest he was in danger. There were no known enemies, no shadowy figures lurking at the edges of his life. If Jonah had walked away from that wreck with the intention of vanishing, he had done so without leaving even the faintest psychological footprint behind. One investigator later described the case as structurally unsatisfying. Every avenue followed led to a dead end. The evidence pointed in too many directions at once, canceling itself out. He survived, but not long enough to be found. He walked away, but not far enough to leave proof. He carried personal items, yet some appeared in places he should not have been able to reach. As weeks turned into months, the case file thickened while clarity thinned. Jonah McCreary was eventually classified as a missing person presumed deceased, a designation that closed certain doors while opening none. It was an administrative necessity, not a resolution. And beneath that official label, the central problem remained untouched. A man had been present, alive, and moving after a catastrophic event, and then he wasn't. No witnesses to confirm his final moments. No remains to answer the simplest of questions. Only a paper trail and a stretch of forest that refused to give anything back. The investigation stalled not because it lacked effort, but because it lacked something far more elusive: truth. As time passed and official momentum slowed, Jonah McCreary's disappearance began to take on a second life. One shaped not by search warrants and evidence logs, but by speculation, private analysis, and the uneasy human need to explain what refuses to make sense. Without new facts to anchor the case, theories began to multiply, branching off in different directions, each attempting to impose order on a story that seemed fundamentally resistant to it. The most widely accepted explanation remained the simplest one: exposure. According to this theory, Jonah's injuries, particularly the head trauma suggested by blood inside the vehicle, would have left him confused, disoriented, and incapable of making rational decisions. In the darkness, surrounded by unfamiliar terrain, he may have walked until exhaustion overtook him. The forest, dense and uneven, could easily conceal a body indefinitely. Animals, weather, and time would do the rest. To many investigators, this was not only plausible, but likely. And yet, even this explanation faltered under closer scrutiny. Search teams had covered the surrounding area extensively, not once, but multiple times, under different conditions. If Jonah had collapsed within a reasonable distance of the crash site, there should have been something: clothing fibers, disturbed ground, bone fragments, anything at all. Instead, the forest yielded nothing, as though Jonah had never entered it in the first place. For a man leaving behind blood, footprints, and personal belongings, the absence of a final trace felt profoundly wrong. Another theory suggested that Jonah had reached a road or a remote structure and encountered another person. In this version of events, he was picked up, either by a well-meaning stranger or someone with less honorable intentions. The witness report of a man matching his description walking along a remote access road gave this idea just enough credibility to linger. But it raised uncomfortable questions. Why would no one come forward definitively? Why was there no confirmed sighting afterward? And how did an injured man manage to travel that far without leaving clearer evidence of his journey? Then there were the theories that people spoke about more quietly, often prefaced with hesitation. Some suggested that Jonah's disappearance was intentional, that the accident, catastrophic as it was, became an opportunity, a reset, a chance to walk away from a life that, while stable on the surface, may have felt suffocating beneath it. Supporters of this idea pointed to the fact that he survived the crash and made a deliberate choice to leave the vehicle. But those who truly knew Jonah found this theory the hardest to accept. He was not a man who vanished without planning, and planning was his defining trait. There was no evidence of preparation, no money set aside, no alternate identity waiting in the wings. If Jonah had chosen to disappear, he had done so in a way that contradicted everything about his character. It would have required a level of spontaneity and secrecy that simply did not align with who he was. As these competing narratives circulated, the case began to fracture along lines of belief rather than evidence. People gravitated toward the explanation that felt most emotionally tolerable, some choosing the inevitability of nature, others clinging to the possibility that Jonah might still be alive somewhere, having escaped the gravity of that night. What none of the theories could do, however, was explain every piece of the puzzle at once. Each one illuminated certain facts while casting others into deeper shadow. And in that growing space between explanation and contradiction, Jonah McCreary's disappearance settled into something more enduring than a cold case. It became a question without an answer, one that lingered not because it was sensational, but because it refused to be resolved. To understand why Jonah McCreary was never found, many believe you have to understand the land itself, not as a backdrop, but as an active presence in the story. The forest surrounding the crash site was not the kind that welcomed visitors. It was old, layered, and dense, shaped by decades of neglect and minimal human interference. From the road, it appeared deceptively ordinary. Step just a few yards inside, and it became something else entirely. The terrain dropped and rose unpredictably, carved by runoff, hidden ravines, and narrow animal paths that led nowhere a human would intentionally go. The ground was soft in places, thick with moss and decaying leaves, but just as often it hardened into rock-strewn slopes capable of erasing footprints almost as quickly as they were made. What track searchers did find were fleeting, incomplete, and frustratingly inconclusive. The forest did not preserve evidence, it consumed it. At night, the environment grew even more hostile. Without artificial light, depth perception collapsed. Distances became meaningless. Sounds traveled strangely, distorted by trees and uneven ground, making it impossible to tell whether something was close or impossibly far away. A man suffering from a head injury could easily believe he was walking toward safety while unknowingly circling deeper into isolation. Investigators noted something else that rarely made it into official summaries. The area was riddled with water. Not wide rivers, but narrow streams, marshy lowlands, and seasonal runoff channels that shifted with rainfall. These waterways were shallow enough to seem harmless, yet deep enough in places to trap a weakened person. If Jonah had fallen into one, especially at night, the current could have carried him far from where he entered, depositing him in terrain that search teams never fully examined. Then there was the matter of time. The hours immediately following the crash were critical, and they slipped away quietly. Darkness slowed response times. Weather conditions changed subtly, enough to degrade scent trails and soften impressions in the soil. By the time daylight returned and the search expanded, the forest had already begun its quiet work of erasure. What might have been visible just hours earlier was gone. Seasonal changes only compounded the problem. Leaves fell. Snow came and melted. Underbrush thickened. Each passing week layered the landscape over itself, burying whatever secrets it held beneath new growth and decay. Searchers returned again and again, but they were never searching the same forest twice. Some locals, familiar with the area long before Jonah's disappearance, spoke with a kind of resigned certainty. People went missing there, they said, not often enough to draw attention, but often enough to be remembered. The land did not announce its dangers. It waited. This perspective reframed the mystery in unsettling ways. Perhaps Jonah had not vanished in defiance of logic, but in accordance with it, overpowered not by intent or malice, but by an environment that required only a single mistake to claim someone forever. And yet, even this explanation struggled to account for everything. The misplaced personal item, the witness report, the sudden, total absence of a final trace. The forest could hide a body, yes, but could it truly erase a man so completely? In the end, the landscape offered no answers, only context. It showed how Jonah could be lost. It did not explain why he was. For Jonah McCreary's family and friends, the shock of his disappearance was not something that faded with time. It settled like a heavy, unshakable fog. In the days immediately following the crash, they were caught between hope and horror, alternating between clinging to the possibility that he would be found alive and confronting the grim reality that perhaps he never would be. His parents, in particular, were left with questions that offered no relief. They replayed every interaction, every phone call, trying to find a clue they had missed. The last words he had spoken, the mundane mentions of traffic, weather, and arrival time, became painfully significant. Those words had carried nothing ominous, nothing to suggest fear, yet they were the final evidence of a life abruptly severed from the world. Friends described him as dependable and thoughtful, someone who checked in regularly, whose absence was immediately noticed but difficult to comprehend. To them, the disappearance was more than a mystery. It was a rupture in the fabric of their daily lives. Among his closer circle, grief took on unusual forms. Some felt guilt for not insisting he take someone with him on the trip. Others raged silently at the randomness of the event, at the forest and road and chance that seemed to conspire together. A few fell into obsessive routines, studying maps, tracing his known routes, and attempting to reconstruct the final day hour by hour. Each person sought control in a situation that offered none. The community, too, was affected, though in subtler ways. Local news reports and online forums spread the story rapidly, each retelling layering speculation over fact. The conversation became a collective act of trying to process the inexplicable. Even strangers felt the weight of his absence. Jonah had been a man of ordinary habits, yes, but he was recognizable in the kind of way that reminds people of their own routines, their own safety, and the fragility of it all. If someone as careful and grounded as Jonah could vanish, anyone could. Family members eventually established search efforts of their own, retracing the official grids, walking trails at night, and leaving notes at local spots in the hope that he might find them. These efforts became rituals of remembrance as much as attempts at rescue. Each step, each call, each trace of hope was tempered by the creeping awareness that time was no longer on their side. And yet, despite all this, Jonah's absence became more than a missing person case. It became a symbol of uncertainty, the kind that can haunt everyday life. Empty chairs at the dinner table, unchecked mail, and the slow, almost imperceptible dimming of routine signals. The family felt his absence as a constant presence. Every quiet moment, every ordinary routine, reminded them of what had been lost. In the face of this uncertainty, they could do nothing but wait, hope, and question. And those questions, the why and how, lingered with intensity, refusing to fade, each one a shadow cast by the inexplicable disappearance of a man who had once moved through the world with careful predictability. Jonah's story was no longer just his own. It had become an open wound in the lives of everyone who had known him. As the weeks stretched into months after Jonah McCreary's disappearance, a strange phenomenon began to emerge. Reports of sightings that didn't fit neatly into the official timeline. At first, these were dismissed as mistaken identity. People in remote areas who bore a passing resemblance to Jonah, wearing similar clothing, walking alone along back roads. But as the reports accumulated, patterns began to emerge that no one could easily explain. One evening, a truck driver passing through a remote stretch of the forested route where Jonah had disappeared claimed to see a man walking along the edge of the tree line. The figure moved deliberately but cautiously, almost as if trying to stay hidden, yet he seemed unharmed and mobile. The truck driver's account placed the sighting hours after the crash, in a location several miles from the wreck, in rough terrain that would have been nearly impossible for an injured man to traverse quickly. When investigators checked the area, they found no footprints, no signs of passage, only the faint impression of something flattened in the underbrush, almost imperceptible. In another instance, A hiker reported spotting a man matching Jonah's description near an abandoned cabin along a secondary forest trail. The hiker said the man paused to observe the hiker from a distance, then disappeared into the trees without leaving a trace. This sighting, too, could not be verified. Search parties scoured the area afterward, but there was no evidence of habitation or passage, only the silent, indifferent forest. Rumors spread even faster than sightings. Local folklore intertwined with the unexplained circumstances. Some whispered that the forest itself had claimed him, a kind of natural trap that resisted human understanding. Others speculated about more sinister possibilities, an unknown figure in the woods, a hidden dwelling, or even foul play disguised as accident. Among online communities, theories ran wild, connecting Jonah's disappearance to everything from deliberate disappearance to supernatural speculation. Each new rumor fueled curiosity, fear, and frustration in equal measure. Even law enforcement admitted privately that some reports were too consistent to ignore. Yet without hard evidence, they could not act. Witness accounts contradicted one another in subtle ways. Timelines didn't match, and locations were impossible to reconcile with Jonah's known condition. The forest swallowed certainty. These strange sightings, whether true or imagined, did one thing with absolute clarity. They refused to let Jonah McCreary's story settle into neat closure. Every report, no matter how fleeting, was a reminder that he might still be out there, or that the circumstances of his disappearance were far stranger than anyone could imagine. The mystery had grown larger than the accident itself, and each whisper of a sighting deepened the sense of unease surrounding a man who had vanished in full view of the world, only to leave behind shadows and questions. As time passed and the initial shock faded, some of the speculation surrounding Jonah McCreary's disappearance began to take on darker, more unsettling tones. What had once been the realm of plausible explanations, accidental death, exposure, disorientation, gradually gave way to ideas that chilled those closest to the case. In quiet conversations and online forums, people began to ask questions that were no longer just about where Jonah might be, but about who, or what, might have interfered with him. One theory suggested foul play. The notion was simple. Someone could have taken advantage of the crash, knowing that Jonah was injured and vulnerable. There were no signs of a struggle at the vehicle, but some argued that the footprints leading away from the wreck could have been staged to mislead searchers. The abandoned personal item found miles from the crash added fuel to the idea, perhaps dropped intentionally as a breadcrumb for investigators or a cruel signal from someone else. It was impossible to confirm, and yet the thought refused to leave those who considered it. Other theories were even more unsettling. Some investigators privately entertained the idea that Jonah might have encountered someone or something that existed beyond the understanding of normal circumstances. The forest, with its dense cover, hidden ravines, and deceptive terrain, could have concealed another party entirely. The witness accounts of Jonah walking hours after the crash added credibility to this line of thinking. How could an injured man traverse miles of rugged forest without leaving a trace, unless someone or something assisted or restrained him? Among the family and friends, these darker possibilities were nearly unbearable. It was one thing to imagine Jonah lost, confused, or exhausted. It was another to imagine that someone or something had intervened deliberately. Still, even in the absence of proof, the theory lingered, whispered quietly in phone calls, letters, and late-night conversations, a shadow creeping over the memory of the man they once knew. What made the theories particularly chilling was their plausibility within the context of Jonah's last known moments. He survived a crash that should have killed him, walked away into darkness, and then disappeared completely. That sequence of events defied ordinary expectations. If foul play was involved, it had been executed with meticulous subtlety, leaving almost nothing behind. If the explanation was natural, it was a cruel, almost supernatural alignment of circumstance and environment. Either way, the answers were hidden, just out of reach, and the darkness surrounding them seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. By now, Jonah's disappearance was no longer just a tragic accident. It had become a narrative of uncertainty, tension, and fear, one that haunted not only those who searched for him, but anyone who learned the details of his last hours. Every anomaly, every sighting, every unanswered question deepened the sense that the forest had swallowed him not by accident, but by design, leaving only echoes of what had once been a predictable, orderly life. The question remained, was Jonah McCreary a victim of circumstance, or had he vanished into something far more deliberate and sinister? Once the initial shock of Jonah McCreary's disappearance settled, the story began to take on a life of its own in the public eye. Local news outlets first reported the accident, framing it as a tragic vehicle crash with an unusual twist. The driver was missing. But as details emerged, the footprints vanishing into the woods, the personal item miles away, and witness accounts that contradicted timelines, the narrative shifted from routine reporting to something far more gripping. The story became impossible to ignore. Soon, national media picked up the case. News segments highlighted the eerie aspects: the man who survived a catastrophic crash, the forest that seemed to swallow him whole, the unexplainable footprints. Headlines posed questions rather than answers, asking, did he walk away? Or is the forest hiding him? With each retelling, the mystery expanded, and the public began to fill the gaps with speculation. Social media amplified every rumor, turning the disappearance into a widespread obsession. People theorized endlessly about Jonah's fate, debating whether he had been a victim, a willing fugitive, or the target of something far darker. Podcasts and online forums dedicated entire episodes to analyzing the crash site, the terrain, and the inconsistencies in witness reports. Amateur sleuths pored over satellite imagery, topographic maps, and every scrap of publicly available information. The internet gave life to countless what-if scenarios, each more intricate and imaginative than the last. Some suggested Jonah had survived and built a hidden life somewhere, while others theorized foul play or even supernatural involvement. Every theory had a following, and every following contributed to the sense that Jonah's story could never truly be solved. For the family, this public fascination was a double-edged sword. On one hand, media attention kept Jonah's story alive, increasing the likelihood that someone with information might come forward. On the other hand, the constant speculation was painful and intrusive. Rumors circulated that painted Jonah in ways that contradicted the careful, thoughtful man they knew. Articles and posts suggested motives or hidden intentions that simply did not exist. Every headline became a reminder that the world was watching him vanish, turning grief into a spectacle. Yet the obsession persisted. Even years later, new theories continued to surface. Books were written, documentaries proposed, and amateur investigators returned repeatedly to the crash site, hoping to uncover what had been missed. The story had become more than a local tragedy. It had transformed into a cultural riddle, a narrative that blurred the line between fact and legend. Jonah McCreary was no longer just a man who disappeared. He had become a symbol of the unknowable, a case that forced people to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes survival does not guarantee safety, and visibility does not guarantee certainty. The public fascination ensured that his absence was not forgotten, and that, in the absence of answers, the story continued to grow, shaped by hope, fear, and the human desire to make sense of the senseless. For those directly involved in Jonah McCreary's case, the disappearance was not simply a matter of evidence and procedure. It became an emotional burden that lingered long after the search parties were disbanded. Investigators who had worked tirelessly through the nights reported a sense of disquiet that refused to leave them, a nagging unease that something fundamental had been missed. Every detail, from the footprints that abruptly stopped to the personal item found miles away, haunted them. The unanswered questions weighed on their judgment, making it impossible to see the case as closed, even when official records suggested otherwise. Search teams who had combed the forest spoke quietly among themselves about the almost uncanny nature of the terrain. They described the sensation of moving through it, the way it seemed to rearrange itself, and the strange feeling that someone, or something, was always just beyond sight. Some volunteers admitted to nightmares in which they retraced Jonah's final steps, only to watch him vanish once more, leaving them powerless to help. The forest became a psychological presence, more than just a backdrop. It was a character in the story, one that seemed to mock their efforts. For the family, the toll was profound and unrelenting. Parents, siblings, and close friends reported an almost physical ache of absence, a constant tension between hope and grief. Every ringing phone, every unexpected knock at the door triggered a flicker of possibility, followed by crushing disappointment. Ordinary routines became unbearable reminders of what had been lost. A morning coffee prepared for two, an empty chair at the dinner table, the notebooks Jonah had always carried, now collecting dust on a shelf. Some family members turned to obsessive investigation of their own. They mapped the forest, recorded weather patterns from the night of the crash, and even monitored forums and social media for any new sightings or rumors. Each fragment of information offered a flicker of hope, but also renewed pain when it led nowhere. Sleep became intermittent, anxiety constant. In some cases, relationships strained under the weight of differing interpretations and coping mechanisms. Mental health professionals who later consulted with the family noted a phenomenon that often arises in disappearances: ambiguous loss. Unlike confirmed death, ambiguous loss leaves no clear endpoint, no closure, and no ability to mourn fully. The human mind resists ambiguity, yet here it was unavoidable. Jonah McCreary's survival of the crash, followed by his sudden vanishing, created a void in which nothing could be definitively known. Even among seasoned investigators, the psychological strain was evident. Some reported lingering feelings of guilt, questioning whether another search method, a different timing, or a single overlooked clue could have made a difference. Others admitted to dreams and intrusive thoughts, replaying every moment of the night of the crash in a never-ending loop, haunted by the knowledge that the man they sought had simply disappeared into nothingness. By now, Jonah's disappearance had become more than a mystery. It was a psychological burden, a case study in how the human mind struggles to reconcile survival with absence, certainty with the unexplainable. Those who had been closest, both professionally and personally, carried the weight of that void long after the world moved on. Would anyone ever truly understand what happened to him? Or would Jonah McCreary remain a ghost haunting the edges of logic, memory, and grief? Years have passed since Jonah McCreary disappeared, yet the story refuses to fade. His case has become part of local lore, a cautionary tale whispered in nearby towns, studied by investigators, and debated endlessly in forums and podcasts. The accident that should have ended his life, and the inexplicable survival that followed. continues to capture the imagination of those drawn to mysteries that defy explanation. Jonah's disappearance has transcended the circumstances of the crash, transforming into a symbol of uncertainty, fragility, and the limits of human understanding. For his family, the void Jonah left remains ever present. Birthdays pass with one less chair at the table, holidays are quieter, and conversations are punctuated by the unspoken absence of a man who once defined so much of their everyday life. Yet despite the grief, there is also a determination not to let his memory fade. They share stories of his humor, his meticulous habits, his small quirks, the way he arranged his notebooks with near-religious precision, the way he would check locks repeatedly before leaving home, the way he appreciated the subtle beauty in ordinary days. These fragments of Jonah McCreary's life are preserved as fiercely as any evidence, the human legacy he left behind even in his absence. The case also continues to challenge investigators, amateur sleuths, and writers. Every year, new search efforts are proposed, new angles analyzed, and new theories debated. From exposure and accident to intentional disappearance or foul play, the possibilities remain open, each plausible yet incomplete. Every anomaly, the footprints that end without explanation, the personal item found far from the crash, the fleeting sightings reported in the days following the accident, continues to defy conventional logic, leaving the story suspended between fact and conjecture. Jonah McCreary's disappearance has left a mark far beyond the forested ravine where it began. It is studied as a case that challenges assumptions about survival, the natural world, and human behavior under extreme stress. It raises questions that remain unanswered. Did he wander into the wilderness and succumb to the elements? Or did he encounter forces, human or otherwise, that carried him away from everything he knew? Did he make a conscious choice to vanish, or was he simply swallowed by circumstance? The more time passes, the more the story seems to insist on its own mystery, refusing to be solved or neatly contained. Ultimately, the legacy of Jonah McCreary is both tragic and enduring. A man defined by careful planning and deliberate action vanished in a single moment of chaos, leaving behind questions that no search or theory can fully resolve. His story endures because it touches something universal, the fear of the unknown, the fragility of life, and the possibility that even the most predictable existence can be disrupted in ways no one can foresee. And perhaps, in that lingering uncertainty, Jonah's disappearance continues to live, not just in records and reports, but in the minds of those who hear his story, who feel the tension between survival and vanishing, and who are left to wonder, decades later, where did he go, and why does he remain unseen?